Well, good evening everyone and welcome to the Institute of Economic Affairs. I'm Victoria Hewson, Head of Regulatory Affairs here at the IEA, and I'm very excited to be introducing today's discussion, Does English Football Need an Independent Regulator? Well, the fan-led review that the government commissioned concluded in its report published last year that the answer to that question is yes, and it put forward a rather complicated licensing regime modelled on financial services to be overseen by a new regulator called IREF, modelled on the FCA, and it also included proposals for new rights and powers for fans, like a golden share and shadow boards of clubs, to give them vetoes over key decisions about the clubs that they support. The review was triggered by the collapse of Burnley Football Club, and then following that by the abortive European Super League, and then by the problems that clubs faced during the shutdowns during the pandemic. Now, broadly speaking, the government and the experts who led and contributed to the fan-led review feel that the game is at a precipice and private owners simply can't be trusted to run the clubs that have this special value to communities and fans. And they think that new laws and a state regulator will be able to redress the balance and ensure that the game is run fairly and in the interests of fans. Now, in a report published today, my colleague Glenn Shackleton and I have examined these proposals, and it's fair to say that we are not convinced that they are necessary at all, and indeed we're quite worried about some of the unintended consequences that could result. However, for the purposes of this evening, I'm going to be a neutral referee and allow our distinguished panel to debate this question. So I am delighted to welcome our guests. First of all, Damian Collins, MP, the Member of Parliament for Folkstone and Hythe since 2010. From 2015 to 2019, he was the chair of the influential Culture, Media and Sport Select Committee, where he oversaw several major parliamentary inquiries, including into the BBC, fake news, and crucially for today's purposes, sports governance. Professor Len Shackleton is an editorial and research fellow here at the IEA and Professor of Economics at the University of Buckingham. He was formerly Dean of the Royal Docks Business School at the University of East London and Dean of the Westminster Business School. And he's also worked as an economist in the civil service. He is now editor of the journal Economic Affairs, which is co-published by the IEA and the University of Buckingham. And finally, last but not least, we have Simon Jordan, serial entrepreneur who made his fortune in the mobile phone industry, having built up his company from scratch. In 2000, he bought Crystal Palace Football Club, and during his 10 years in the game, he became one of the most recognisable faces in the game and led Crystal Palace to the Premier League, making him the youngest Premier League football club owner at just 36. He now co-presents White and Jordan, which is TalkSPORT's flagship football show with Jim White. He's a popular and frequent guest on panel shows with Jeremy Vine, The Right Stuff, The Debate, and also used to present The Final Word on TalkSPORT. He's now also a restaurant owner and founder of Octane magazine. So, to start off with, I'm going to ask each of our panellists to take a couple of minutes to give a quick summary of your views on the proposal and the question that we're debating today. Then I'm going to ask a few questions from my side, and then I'm going to open it up to questions from the audience. Now we are in fact recording, as I speak, we're going to record the first half of the panel discussion, but not the Q&A, so the second half will be an off-the-record discussion. So, Damian, would you like to start us off? Why are you supporting these proposals?
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you this evening. When you look at the failure of some football clubs in recent years, Bury being the one that triggered the fan-led review, if you look at the current problems at a club like Derby County, which is deep in administration and may not come out, the first thing that struck me, I remember going up to Kick Lane in Bury to meet the fans, the supporters groups there, after the club had gone bust and we kicked out the league, is that the problems are avoidable. And they're avoidable without creating any new rules and regulations. If the rules of the Football League have been enforced correctly, if the protocols that limit the amount of money a club can spend on players' salaries had actually been enforced and anyone had checked in real time, then those clubs, then Bury wouldn't have gone bust and Derby wouldn't have gone into administration. There is a lack of effective oversight of how clubs are run, which means that clubs can get away with trading outside of the laws and rules of their own leagues. Something you might say is anti-competitive in many ways. It puts unsustainable pressure on other clubs who seek to compete against them, trying to spend ever more of money that they don't have, trying to sustain their position relative to other clubs as well. So if there was better enforcement of financial conduct rules for football clubs, then they would be running in a sustainable way. And that requires a regulatory body that has got the right to know what a club is spending, what's going through its books, to be able to check in real time. When Bury went bust, not only had it not published its accounts for the previous accounting year, nor had it from the year before that. This creates a culture where clubs largely self-declare their income and rely on soft loans from their owners, which sometimes may not appear or can run out. So football could do this better for itself, but what has always struck me is the problem with football competitions, and football regulation is principally around not the regulation of businesses, but the regulation of clubs taking part in a sporting competition. The primary interest of the competitional authorities is the integrity of the competition itself rather than the survival of any one club. But because the competitions are run by the clubs that play in them, the Football League is effectively run by the chairmen and women of the Football League clubs. The Premier League is effectively run by the chairmen and women of the Premier League clubs. They may not be that interested in independent scrutiny, real-time reporting, proper financial scrutiny of their affairs that would keep them on the straight and narrow. And therefore, it doesn't happen. The Premier League has got the resources to do some of these things quite well, and I think particularly checking the background and integrity of new club owners to see whether they are fit for purpose. The Football League does not have those resources, and as a consequence, I think it's the place you're more likely to see club failures. There would be resistance from the club competitions to having the Football Association regulate them, part of the unique politics of football and the bodies within it. So the question has arisen about whether there should be an independent regulator with certain powers to have in real-time financial, real-time access to accounts in particular. There's a lot in the report around, capital ratios, how much money clubs hold to make sure they can meet their obligations, pay their players the contracts that they say they would pay any transfer instalments to other clubs that are due. There are some quite high standards set for that within the fan-led review. But I think at its heart is a principle that already exists, certainly in the divisions just outside the Football League, in the National League, which is clubs have to prove they've got the money to complete the season, that they can meet their financial obligations during the course of the season, and that's one of the conditions of being able to play. So in some form, some of these ideas already exist. But I think that is what we need to bring into football, and it will probably require an independent regulator to do it. And finally, I would just say, in other industries, broadcasting being one, the idea of a fit and proper person test, a discretionary test, exercised by a regulatory body already exists. Ofcom issues broadcasting licenses, it can rescind broadcasting licenses. In football, people often talk about the fit and proper person test, ownership test. They don't exist. There is no active rule in football that's any different from stopping someone being a director of any company in the UK. And there have been times when the football authorities have wanted to act against an owner when they had concerns about their source of funds or their background reputation or offences they committed in the past, particularly in the case of Massimo Cellino when he was on and off owner of Leeds United. And what they found was, even if the Football League said, we don't trust you, we don't think you're the right person to own one of our clubs, there was nothing in law they could do to stop them. And there are a whole myriad of issues, which I'm sure will come up in questions around the way football is run at the moment. But at its heart, the fan-led review is calling for an independent body, at least to enforce football's own rules on its own clubs, and to do so independently.
Thank you very much. Great start. Len, over to you. What's your take? And perhaps you could give us a gist of what's the argument of our paper that we're talking about and that we've published today.
How long have we got? Can I start out by saying that one of the things that Victoria and I do is look at regulation across the economy and see how this story fits into it. And last October, Kwasi Kwarteng introduced a consultation paper on regulation where he said that the government should only regulate and get only involved in regulation when it's absolutely necessary and proportionate. And I think what we feel is that it's neither necessary nor proportionate. It's certainly not proportionate. When we look at regulating other industries, there are usually two things we think about. One is the market power argument, that firms may be so big that they can exploit consumers or exploit suppliers, and something has to be done about this. Or alternatively, that there are serious externalities like pollution and so forth, which mean that some form of regulation is necessary. Now, these things don't apply when we talk about football. If you look at the justification which Tracy Crouch puts forward in this review, it's largely to do with what she calls financial instability, which turns out to mean that clubs persistently spend more than their revenue. And this is seen as inherently a bad thing. Now, I think you need to put this into a wider context. Many companies... Sorry? Closer? Yeah, all right. Hello. Many companies will operate for a long period of time where their outgoings exceed their revenue. Many of the most dynamic companies in the modern period, people like Amazon, for example, or Spotify, or any of these companies, operate for long periods when their revenue doesn't meet their outgoings. So there's nothing particularly unusual about this. And in football, it's been the case since the year dot. I read, when it first came out, that shows how old I am, the Norman Chester review in 1968 on football. And in that paper, he bemoaned the fact that clubs were spending more than their revenue, in exactly the same way that Tracy Crouch does today. And yet, of the 92 football clubs which were in the Football League at that time, all of them still exist. Some of them, like my own poor club Southport, have moved down into non-league and so forth, but they all still exist in one form or another. So there's a great deal of resilience in the system, which I think the Crouch Review ignores. And this idea that you shouldn't be allowed to spend more than your revenue or within very tight limits would really preclude competition from new clubs. We've recently, of course, had the problems around Chelsea and so forth. Chelsea was, put into its current eminence through the. Am I going to sing or what? through Roman Abramovich consistently supporting the club financially, but other clubs too. Leicester, for example, who were a middle-of-the-road kind of team for many years, became Premier League champions through the support of their sadly now dead owner. But this happens all the way down the league. Sugar daddies in one form or another support football, have always supported football. If you look at Forest Green Rovers, supported by that guy with the eco-energy stuff.
Delvince.
That's the man. If you look at Salford City, who are in the Football League now, they were obviously supported by ex-Manchester United players. Now, this is a problem, maybe, but I think the way in which the Crouch Review talks about it, it's totally out of proportion. What we've got in these proposals is tighter corporate governance than the Financial Conduct Authority imposes on large banks and financial institutions. We've got detailed reporting procedures, we've got compulsory levies on clubs and redistribution, which the regulator can just decide that the Premier League must give more resources to other parts of the system and so. It's also totally unclear to me what the relationship is going to be between this new regulator and the existing football authorities, which, as Damian has said, already do quite a lot in this area. This morning I was reading the FA's 60-page guide on VAT, for example, which of course is very important for football clubs. So really, my point is that we don't need this regulator. The regulation which is proposed is totally disproportionate to the alleged problem. And a final point I would make, as a supporter of a non-league football club, this concentrates far too much on the Premier League and the Championship. We have a vast number of semi-professional clubs in this country. 750 teams entered for the FA Cup this year. And most of those are paying people and in small scale face many of the issues which Premier League clubs do, and yet they're totally ignored in this analysis. And that's the point I'd like to come back to later on.
Thanks very much, Len. So, Simon, you've been involved in many different aspects of the game.
Indeed, I have.
How do you see this?
Well, I speak from a position of someone that's lost £50 million in a football club, so I can look at the ecosystem through a set of eyes. For a set of eyes as someone that went into it and had very balanced views about what it could be, what it should be, and what it ultimately was. Now, I look at the situation. Do I need this? Yeah. I look at the situation where a report should be produced with an objective frame of mind rather than a subjective point of view. If you're going to produce a report to make every single part of it deliver the outcome that you want, then you're not really looking at a report that's particularly objective. If we can look at the three principles of where football in this country is and where it really is, right, and we can agree upon them, I think, relatively simply, there is a need to protect cultural assets, and let's call sporting football clubs cultural assets for the purpose of this conversation. There is clearly a need for better distribution in football. If you understand in professional football, let me just make it about the 92 teams, or we can get into the non-league guys as and when we need to, but the 92 teams, if you've got 90% of the distributions going to 20 teams and 10% going to 72 teams, and they're all bound together by a collective business, then you can see the disparity in the distributions. And then you look at the governance. So you've got three parts of the equation that will need to be remedied, which are protecting sporting cultural assets against the Roman Abramovich, against the Sheikh Mansours, against bad owners, or whatever other terminology you want to use. And bad owners come in all shapes and guises. We've got to look at the distribution so there's a fair, equitable funding and feeding of the ecosystem so that all football clubs can thrive and survive in an environment. And then you've got to look at the governance. So if you agree that those are three sensible points of view, then you start to look at the mechanism of delivery. And the mechanism of delivery that's being advanced is independent regulation, is that mechanism of delivery. I look at that and say, look at the, there's no debate that English football is successful. The mechanisms that are being deployed to make it successful leave it slightly dysfunctional, but there is no argument in world football that our domestic leagues are the financial powerhouses of domestic football. So why do we need a regulator in this country when no other country has a regulator governing their sport or their particular segment of sport being football? You then look at the mechanisms that are being deployed currently and the ideals behind an independent regulator being the solution. It is undoubtable that the de facto, in principle, regulator of English football is the FA. The fact that they're incompetent at this moment in time or don't have the constitutional powers or the legislative support to be able to do what's fundamentally required. We can debate and we can spin off about fit and proper owners tests. And some of the things Damian said is right, some of it's nonsense. You could not legislate for people like Mel Morris with a business track record that's made £1 billion going into a football club, losing £250 million of his own money, and no landscape could have protected or stopped that entrance point in the first place. I dealt with Steve Dell. It wasn't Burnley, it was Bury. And if you ever spoke to Steve Dell, who became the Bury owner, there was something deeply corrupt and destructive about that individual, and perhaps the debate could be had about how he got in the door in the first place. But notwithstanding that, the premise of this report, the three axis points of the report that led this fan-led review, and the key component is in the title. It's a fan-led review. It's steeped in sentimentality and lack of objectivity and lack of real-world vantage point. The three crisis points are nonsense. Bury is not a kick-off point. This is an industry that's what other industry do you know that can go back 100 years and see the same people in situ 100 years later? You look at the second analysis, the second crisis point, COVID. I'll leave off. We get a pandemic once every 100 years, so you put a regulator in a fucking industry because you've got a pandemic that comes around once every 100 years that's decimated every single industry. The third point is the ESL. Are we outside of our minds? We have a Premier League, which is virtually a form of incarnation of the ESL. The only slight difference was the original position of the ESL was not about meritocracy. And these guys, like this report, are going to start hard and pare back, because if you start in a negotiation with somebody and you punch them in the stomach and they breathe in, you roll over them. If they push back, then you negotiate, but you start with your strongest position. And the ESL guys were starting with the strongest position. And by the way, who defined UEFA and FIFA as people that aren't doing something similar with meritocracy attached to it? It was they're trying desperately to unwind by using coefficients to justify big clubs competing in their tournaments without merit attached to it as a methodology they wish to deploy. So the premise of this report, and I don't know how many of you have read it, so I've read the 162 pages, and it's 2 hours of my life that I won't get back, because a lot of it does not make sense. It doesn't hang together. You know, the real reality is we've got regulators left, right and centre. There is nobody besides, with due respect, some blowhard politicians that think that this is something that vaguely resembles common sense for football. None of the major players in football. You might get some smaller clubs further down the pyramid that sold themselves for things like the Elite Player Performance Programme because they were being given 250 grand a year by the Premier League, and then they gave away their compensation rights for young boys that they produced and effectively mortgaged their futures by doing so. Nobody, not the EFL, not the self-serving Premier League clubs, what independent regulation is a stalking horse to bring the Premier League to the table, to get better distributions underpinned by better governance, and therein provides a solution to football. It's not difficult, it's not rocket science. It comes from somebody that lost 50 million quid. Okay, I lost 50 million quid at a time when the banking industry went into crisis, a regulated industry, and 50 million quid of my other money was in banking regulated products that I lost as well. So you look at regulation and you understand that 50% of most companies that work in regulated sectors don't want regulations. They don't see it as something that benefits the industry. This isn't an industry that needs to be protected for the consumer. Of course, the sporting aspect of it, side of it does in terms of the cultural value, but not ticket prices and not necessarily consumer value. You've got massive scope for mission creep here. The scale and opportunity for this to be abused and turned into something that it's not. It might look like a good idea, not to be flippant, and it sounds relatively sweeping. We need an independent regulator like NATO needs to operate a no-fly zone over the Ukraine. It might sound like a good idea, but the sequence of unintended events that can come as a result of it are quite dramatic. It won't become a taxpayer issue, because the industry wouldn't have the audacity to ask the taxpayer to pay for it. But when you sit here and you listen to politicians, as I have done over the last 2 years, talk about the state of English football and how wealthy it is by only looking at the Premier League and forgetting that the Premier League is an island on its own right, cast away because it had the commercial wherewithal to do so, and the vacuum of leadership in the Football League, which is now being bridged by capable operators. You don't need independent regulation. You need a reconstituted, recalibrated FA. Otherwise, what's it there for? If it's not fit for purpose, get rid of it. And you need legislative support to be able to enforce mechanisms to make sure that the distributions are in place with governance underneath it. Job done, end of discussion. Don't need an administrator at £20 million a year making up rules as they go along.
Thanks, Simon. Strong stuff.
I'll sit on the fence.
And you're absolutely right. I did say Burnley, didn't I? I meant Bury. So apologies to any Burnley fans and Alistair Campbell, if he's watching.
Never apologise. Never.
So, Damian, can I come back to you for a bit of a deeper dive on some of how the proposals will work in practice, and in particular, the proposals for shadow bans or shadow boards of fan groups and golden shares for these fan groups. Could you say a bit about how that's intended to work, and perhaps address whether there's actually a danger that this could actually just tie up clubs in attritional battles about developments and actually deter investment in the game from people like Simon and future Simons?
Well, I mean, it's quite a lot there. So starting off with, the golden share. I mean, the golden share is typically used as a term in football, which really means the right to play in a competition. So the golden share is your membership of the Football League or the Premier League, which is your right to play. The ultimate sanction for any club owner would be to be so far in breach of the rules that your golden share was withdrawn. Now, There are so what the report looks at is really what those conditions might be. Whether you would have a situation where the regulator could say, well, take it in a Berry type case where what we're going to do is the business may have gone bust, but we will retain the golden share. We could reissue that golden share to another owner. So is there a way of protecting the institution, the community asset that is the club, from an owner that's gone wrong? Now, I agree with Simon that no regulator can ever predict whether a new owner is going to be a good owner or not. With Mel Morris at Derby, he would have ticked every single box for a perfect club owner. A sort of very successful businessman who made a huge amount of money, that was investing in his local club, the one he'd supported all his life. I mean, kind of like it's what it would be if you were to write a script of what a club owner should be like. It would be like Mel, and it went wrong. And it went wrong. And businesses go wrong. The question I think here with the regulator is what's left at the end. Because can a club recover from a bad owner? What is left at the end of it? We've seen cases in the past, and one of the problems at Derby is there's a mechanism for trying to sustain spending that was too high, that the chairman ultimately couldn't afford, and the club couldn't afford. Is a club now that's massively in debt, that sold its training ground and sold its ground, and is in a much weaker position than it could have been. To the owner, yeah. So it's up to him, but he's under no obligation to give it back. I mean, he could do a deal.
Well, he is, because he personally guarantees the debts of the funders that are funding the administration. So Mel's in a very invidious position.
Yeah, no, he's absolutely in an invidious position. But there's no guarantee that he will do a deal with the administrator in order to clear the debts and make the club sustainable.
No, he'll just have all his properties taken off him in London.
But there are lots of. The idea that football is not regulated is at the moment is wrong as well. It has quite a lot of rules that make football clubs very unlike other sorts of businesses. One being that when a club goes into administration, you have to pay all your football debts, or you're kicked out of the league. You can't do a deal on all the outgoing debts as you would do
football creditor policy.
Yeah, football creditor rule. You can't do a deal in that way.
But there is governance. Damian, there is governance. The governance is ill-formed, ill-educated, immature governance. You're allowed to run your football club losing £105 million every 3 years if you're in the Premier League. You're allowed to run your football club running losses at £39 million if you're in the Championship. I don't know any industry that thinks it's good governance to tell you how much money you're allowed to lose. So we are in the same space, Damian. It's about the mechanism of delivery, about how you bring that to the fore. And it isn't just a case of saying that the only rules that are in place are about the competition. There are financial governance rules in place. The fact that there are huge individuals owning football clubs that are finding clever accountancy to get around it, which cause a drip-down effect, which has caused the hyperinflation that the Abramoviches, the Sheikh Mansours, and no doubt that delightful crew that now own Newcastle will bring to the fore, are about the control mechanisms that are in place. But the reaction to the fan-led review has been to understand some of the perspectives, but they were already in hand. And I am no person for the establishment. No person. I've seen the level of incompetence inside the Football League. I've seen how it hurt me economically. But again, I go back to the point to make your point about the golden share. What this is advocating there's a model in Germany, which I'm sure a lot of you are privy to, which is a fan-owned model. Yeah. You cannot get a genie back in a bottle. This is the most successful football pyramid in the world. It just needs to grow up a little bit and be made to think about things differently. And that's where independent regulation gets used as a stalking horse, never as an implemented perspective. It has to be believed it's going to be so. And a golden share, if you give the golden share to the fans, who, by the way, of course are the most important part of it, whether it's the eyes on the prize in the stadium or the eyes on the prize through broadcasting deals around the world, you will then get guys investing money into football clubs on the basis of that fans can determine key components of what a football club is going to do going forward. With no economic investment, emotional and sentimental investment, who's going to invest in a business where key decisions can be vetoed by those that have an emotional investment but no economic investment? That is a recipe for disaster.
But Simon, there is a model for this, which could largely be based on actually implementing the rules football's already created for itself. I remember when Bury went bust, with the chairman of the FA, the chief executive of the Football League in front of the committee, and we said what went wrong. And what's quite invidious when they sit there and say, well, we've got these salary protocol rules, we don't enforce them. We don't enforce them. And you can't have it both ways. And I think, how do you break?
Because it was a protocol, not a rule, Damian. That's why it was the protocol in the Football League was different.
But when you see the heads of these football bodies praying in aid of these rules they've created, saying this is to stop failure, and yet they don't enforce them or can't enforce them, them. And there is a problem there. And if the FA could reform itself, well, we can't abolish the FA. I mean, the FA is our sort of interlocutor into FIFA, and it's beyond the control. It's not the control of the government to decide whether to abolish the FA or not, or any other sporting body. But how do you break the impasse?
It's supposed to be the regulator. The FA is supposed to be the de facto regulator.
But if it is failing in that role, and I think we would both agree that there is failure of governance in football here. It could be, if it was the FA could
failure
be
of implementation.
Yeah, if the FA could be reformed, it could do a lot of the things that the report sets out the regulator could do. The reason we're at this impasse is we've had decades of reports, inquiries, from government departments, Parliament, and so on, saying what needs to be done. And yet the football authorities will not agree to any change, no meaningful change, and therefore we're at this impasse. And do we let that continue? Or do we say we need to put structures in place that football can't create for itself, even just to make sure that football's own rules are enforced?
But sorry, Simon, can I bring Len in? I will come back to you, of course. But Len, I think you...
It's just getting quite interesting.
I was going to ask you, because you're, I think, more sceptical of the redistributive proposals, the redistribution elements of these proposals, in fact, mainly from the perspective of these lower league clubs. Can you talk a bit about your concerns for those clubs, the grassroots clubs, the lower end of the pyramid?
Okay, well, there's two things there. Football has, for a very long time, has had redistribution. I mean, when I was young, you shared the gates and things like this, right? Clearly, that's good. That's something which we want to preserve. But the idea that a regulator should be able to instruct the clubs that they must pay a transfer levy and they must do this, that, and the other, and so forth, I think that's wrong, fundamentally. On the question of smaller clubs, this is a point I was trying to make earlier on. One of the problems with what is being proposed here is it's not clear how far down this is going to go. Somewhere in the Crouch Review, it suggests that it's going to apply to 115 clubs, which takes us down through the National League. The FA also has an interest in 3 levels below that. So we talk about quite a long way down the pyramid. But a lot of the kind of things which are being suggested in this report require a huge amount of compliance. A lot of box ticking. It's modelled on the Financial Conduct Authority, for heaven's sake, with a whole load of things which you have to get right about who's on the board of directors, business plans submitted on particular periods.
But there are different tiers, though, aren't there? I mean, there are, in fairness to the report,
there are different tiers. Oh, yeah, but Simon, there is a ratchet on this, which you may not have noticed.
Yeah,
that, if you get relegated, you still have to apply the same rules which you had in the higher league. So that over time is going to mean this is going to spread all the way down.
That's by design. They want it to spread all the way down. That's what the ratchet's
regulatory
there for.
creep, which is what
there's absolutely mission creep. And if you look at some of the premises of the report, in one part of the report it talks about the profligacy and bad owners, guys like me that spend too much money, right, as a bad owner, as a model, right? And then later on in the report it goes on to say the governance. Mike Ashley, Newcastle United, bad governance, only board member. This is a football club that made money for 10 years and the fans hated him because it made money. It had no God-given right to be in the Premier League because it's the club that's won nothing, but it's in the Premier League primarily for 8 years out of the 10 or 11 years that Mike owned it, or a little bit longer, because of the fact that he ran a business. So on one hand, you've got the report saying that profligacy is the absolute death knell of the lack of direction football's going in and bringing us to a financial precipice. On the other hand, it's let's use the fan-led part of it to bash an individual football club, because clearly the motivation behind the report is the fans' perspective. And where the football authorities have been very, very poor is communicating properly with the end user, the fan. You can't allow politicians, with respect to Damian, half the time they don't know what they're talking about in terms of the game. I listened to the DCMS examining Roman Abramovich last week and using articles that I wrote in the Times as a bench point. I do know what I'm talking about. I may have lost a lot of money during the time of football, and I may talk about it now more than actually be involved in it. But this is not difficult to straighten this up. The distribution model and the governance go hand in hand. If you distribute properly, and the condition of distribution is proper governance, and not getting into the territory, you're over-regulating, turning it into bureaucratic nonsense. Before you know it, this will end up with what cushions fans are sitting on in seats, because that's what regulators do. You fix You fix the protection of the sporting assets. You get the government to introduce a Sporting Heritage Act, which in it basically ring fences and protects the sporting clubs with a blue plaque above their door, like a Grade 2 listed building, with certain conditionality upon it. You get the distribution mechanisms right, and you put the governance in place. Bang! What do you need a regulator for? They're done. What are they going to do now then? They're going to sit around scratching their backsides, getting licensing fees, creating opportunities to become more and more bureaucratic. And it's not because I don't like regulation, but because I really simply don't believe it needs to exist in the framework that we've got. And if you argue that football in this country is unsuccessful, then what does the rest of the world football look like that doesn't have? Why would we want to disadvantage ourselves against every other league? Why would we want to tax our clubs buying players from abroad as some mechanism to fund the league and disadvantage us against our competition in European football? I mean, it's just madness. And when I look at the architects behind this report, sorry not to personalise it, but with respect to David Bernstein, who's one of the intellectual capitals behind this, David Bernstein was the chairman of the FA, who are supposed to be the regulator. And if you look at David's business career, with the litany of perhaps businesses that have failed, I'm not sure he can talk about governance. And if you look at Salford and Gary Neville, I'm not sure Peter Lim would pass the fit and proper owners test with a football club that ignores the protocols in place. And these are the guys that are the intellectual capital behind some of this report. It's for the birds.
So I'm going to open it up to questions from the floor in just a minute, but I do have one question for Damian, which is, I guess, potentially more about the general political ecosystem where we're operating in here. And so my question is, what's the limiting principle here? Is there anything that you wouldn't want to regulate? I can think of lots of industries that people feel more of a community attachment to, in retail, in the music industry, local pubs, where often they're very badly run, and often if they go bust, it's very sad and disappointing for communities. Is there any limiting principle here where you would say, no, we don't want to regulate that, the market is doing its job?
Well, it goes back to what we said at the beginning. It's been said by Simon as well, that football clubs are community assets. Football grounds are recognised as community assets in law at the moment through the Localism Act. Community right to buy a football sports stadium. The reason all the clubs that were in the Football League in the late 1960s still exist today is not because they've all been carefully managed, it's because where they've gone bust, the fans have brought them back. There are plenty of Phoenix clubs that are back in the Football League.
But doesn't that mean that the system's working? Because it is possible to reconstitute a club from the grassroots and work up, like Bury is doing now, like AFC Wimbledon has done.
I wouldn't say that's an example of success. I mean, it's technically possible. You might be able to after a few years of wrangling, you can get the name back. You can re-enter at a very junior level, and if you're lucky and you get promotion pretty much most years, in about a decade, you might be back at where you were before. So, and that only happens because the community are invested in their club and want to see it go back on its feet. Now, I think for the owners of football clubs are they are custodians of those clubs. Their business acumen, their success, often their own money, may well determine at what level the team can be competitive. But I think what we want to see is an ecosystem where an ownership either fails, someone sells a club on, whatever, however the custodianship of one owner ends and another one starts, that there is still a club. And I think what communities want, what the fans want, is to stop people asset stripping clubs, and running them into the ground. And as Steve Dale did at Bury, sort of basically walking away and leave. He hasn't lost any money out of that club. He just walked away and left a load of debt, and run a club that.
Well, the debt was already there.
But he's and it's the community trying to pick up the pieces. So I don't think it's the job of the regulator to be determining every aspect of how a club is run. And my starting point would be for it to say, look at the rules that football's created for itself on financial fair play, some of the role the FA Council takes on at the moment in protecting heritage assets of clubs, like the colours the team play in, the name of the club. When Hull City wanted to change their name to Hull City Tigers a few years ago. Things like I think the fans have a right to be consulted on some of those things. And do we have an MK Don situation where the owner decides I'm going to move the club somewhere else because I think it will be more successful?
But Damian, you can't speak to that because I was the person that kicked Wimbledon out of Selhurst Park at the time.
Okay,
and know the background to that story.
I know. You're sort of well versed now. Very well versed. But these are sorts of in-principle decisions. You say, and it's not for that. There was a question of Northampton Town ended up playing in Coventry ended up playing in Northampton as well at Sixfields, because of a dispute between the owner of the ground and the owner of the club. So I think that there is a role for regulators to come in here. The starting point could just be the rules football has already created. The issue Simon raises is resolvable if the authorities could fix themselves. But these issues could continue because they
Damian,
won't.
can you use your mic
Sorry.
so the people on YouTube can hear?
Yes, the issues persist because can be no collective agreement within football. The redistribution question, which Simon touched on there, of monies from the Premier League. I mean, the big difference between football now and football 50 years ago is, in the old days, a club based in a big city with a decent catchment area, a decent ground, could compete with anyone, really, in Europe, let alone in the UK, if it got everything right.
But with the broadcast deals.
But the broadcast deals have changed all of that, and they've primed a huge amount of money into the hands of a relatively small number of clubs. How that money is distributed, I think, is a perfectly legitimate debate. But again, it requires lots of different vested interests, who have got agreeing, and at the moment that's proven to be impossible. And I think that's where you come back to saying, well, should there be some independent body that administers these things? And the perennial question with the Premier League, which is the most successful, football league,
and the Championship,
and Championship. But although I think the controls in the Championship are a lot weaker. I think if the Championship was run more like the Premier League, it would probably be more successful. But the problem is when the wealth in the Premier League is so great compared to everything else, should there be a mechanism for redistribution which is consistent, that tracks almost the growing wealth and value of football at the top level, so that the amount that goes back into the grassroots, the amount that is distributed to the clubs at lower levels, is as a percentage of the value of the Premier League roughly consistent. And I think whether it's done through a transfer levy or something else, I think that at its heart is what the report is trying to get at.
Sounds a bit like socialism to me.
Well, the NFL in America is the most successful commercially sporting league in the world.
Hang on.
The owner set it, and for good commercial reasons for them, it's probably simultaneously both the most capitalist and the most socialist sporting competition in the world. But it's the most successful.
Well, if you enjoyed that conversation, why not watch one of these other videos? And while you're here, remember to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. That way, you'll never miss out on a single IEA broadcast.